Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to do something untraditional for me, and will everyone just raise your hand? Just give me a big wave. Hold on, there we go. Give me a big wave. Thank you so much for being here. Wow, I'm really bad at this. And then I have to do one other thing. I tend to be a bit long-winded, so I'm going to put a timer on myself. There, I'll ignore that. Hey, thanks so much. Really appreciate being invited to the Mariners Museum and Park. And I wanted to especially thank Julie, who, of course, has been working to get me out here for a long time. And I'm glad I finally got to be here in person. She's amazing at what she does. And y'all are going to miss her, I think. Also, thanks to Howard and to Dane, who gave me a great tour, and to Liz, who did a fantastic job on the behind-the-scenes tour. What an amazing resource you have here. It's impressive, it is immaculate, and I could not be more impressed and moved by what I saw today. And I only, got 3 hours, so it's not enough time. But and thanks to all of you out there in Virtualville. Really appreciate your being here. Let's see. See if this is going to work. So the book that I'm going to talk about today is Empire of Ice and Stone, The Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. And when I was starting to do some talks about this, I told my editor, I don't want to do spoilers or anything. And he said, Buddy, look at the cover, okay? It says Disastrous Voyage. How do you think this is going to go? But there are a couple spoilers, but I'll let you know ahead of time. I wanted to give you a little bit of backstory about how I'm an accidental historian, as it turns out. I'm an English major, English professor, and I fell into history. Sidebar story: when I was first getting my agent in New York, I was bird hunting in Idaho, and he called me on my phone, and I had sent him this book I wrote about the chukar partridge, the natural history of the chukar partridge. By the way, not a bestseller. And he said, well, you seem to really like hunting. And I was on a cell phone, I was going hunting, and he said, you seem to really like hunting. I really like history. Who are the greatest hunters in American history? And I said, well, it's got to be Davy Crockett, or David Crockett as he goes by, and Daniel Boone. And he said, well, why don't you go off and do some research and write a proposal for me about one of them. And I wrote a proposal about David Crockett, and that 6-month process of writing this immersed me, and I ended up, nobody had written a book about Crockett in about 50 years. This is in 03, 05. And so I kind of proved to myself that I could immerse myself in history for a couple, 3 years and write a serviceable book about the subject. And at that point, I just shifted gears. I had been writing poetry and nonfiction essays about natural history. And so as a result, I also was doing journalism about adventure sports. And so how I came to writing about the Arctic is another sort of circuitous tale. I traveled to Greenland in 2003 to cover this adventure race that was going on there, multi-sport competitions. And I was following a blind adventurer named Eric Weinmeier, who was the first blind person to summit both Mount Everest, all of the 7 summits, and then he was the first blind person to kayak solo down the Grand Canyon. And so I had heard he was going to Greenland, and I had always wanted to go to Greenland, so I sold a couple stories about this and followed him. And at that time, Julie mentioned Mark Burnett. Mark Burnett was creating he's the guy who created Survivor, The Apprentice, and very likely Donald Trump. So I mean, he's a good impresario. Let's say that. Mark Burnett's pretty great at what he does. And this journalism brought me to all of these far-flung places, including some of which Julie mentioned, Borneo, the Philippines, Morocco a few times, and all was in service of following these people who were doing these wild week to 10-day, sometimes 3-week-long, multiple sport endurance competitions. And when I heard there was a blind man going to do this, I embedded myself with his team actually and traveled around Greenland for 10 days. And this is where I went, to Karluk in southeastern Greenland. And summited some spectacular peaks. It's really a remarkable. Anybody been to Greenland? Put it on your bucket list. So that, in fact, is Eric Weinmayer in the bow of the boat paddling, and I got to follow this guy along. And what ended, he's in about this inflatable rubber canoe in these iceberg-strewn fjords. And I was just amazed by the countryside, by the people, by the Inuit that I met. And I did a bit of seal hunting with local Greenlanders. I know this is not a PETA-approved image, but it is, in fact, in Greenland, and it's a big part of Greenlandic Inuit tradition. And in fact, seals are a big part of the book that you're about to hear about, as it turns out. I wanted to add that I was already predisposed to writing about people in extreme situations and circumstances. This is a woman that I met there who kind of started my trail into the Arctic. Her name is Ingrid, and she's from Norway, and she turned me on to a Norwegian explorer named Fridtjof Nansen, who, if anybody's been to Oslo, there's a museum based around his ship, the Fram, or the Fram. But my father was also a Nordic skier and had competed in the 1956 Olympics in Nordic skiing and traveled extensively in Scandinavia. Somewhat unusual because he grew up in Louisiana and had never seen snow until he was 18. So he's kind of impressive in the fact that he ended up being a Nordic skier who grew up in a place that doesn't snow. But he always told me stories about how tough the Scandinavians were and how tough the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians were in really severe conditions. And not only that, I grew up in Sun Valley, Idaho, a ski town, and he would take us out duck hunting about at 25 below zero weather, I think just to toughen us up, but also there was something about the deep cold that really appealed to me, and I haven't figured out exactly what it is, but maybe we'll know a little more about that by the end of the talk. But after Ingrid gave me this book about called The First Crossing of Greenland about Fridtjof Nansen, I was transfixed at like the danger of the places that these people would go in the late 1800s. And, you know, the equipment that we have now is just so different than, you know, they were dealing with skins and having to navigate in ways that we have so much advantage now. And so I kind of got hooked. And during my research, reading about, once you go down the Arctic, Antarctic rabbit hole, I mean, there's just this wealth of storytelling that you discover, and there's so many great tales. And so I was researching a book that Julie referred to called Labyrinth of Ice, which is about the Greely expedition in 1881 to 1884. And as I was doing that, I bumped into this story about the Karluk and the Canadian Arctic expedition. And so I filed it away in this folder thinking, this is an amazing story, and it was even more dramatic than the Greely expedition. And so after I finished Labyrinth of Ice, I immediately began working on Empire of Ice and Stone. The thing about it that I think grabbed me, it's a tale of hardship and survival. At its core, it's a story of two men, the expedition leader, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, and the captain of the Karluk, Bob Bartlett. It's got disaster and terror and joy also on the frozen Arctic seas, shipwreck and mutiny, frostbite, possible murder, privation and starvation, a dramatic rescue attempt, in one of the harshest places that you will ever go on Earth. Sacrifice and courage and camaraderie. What else do you want in a story? You know, I mean, I was in. So the goals of this expedition, and here I'm going to attempt using the little pointer. There we go. The goals of the expedition were originally to explore the seas north of Alaska and Canada, searching for new lands and engaging in anthropological, biological, oceanographical, geographical, marine, and terrestrial study. And there were two parties, the southern and the northern parties, and the southern party was going to perform more land-based study over here. That was the plan. At the time, it was the largest staff, 16 scientists ever carried on a polar expedition. The scientists were from all around the world: Canada, France, Scotland, New Zealand, and Norway, and Australia. Actually, Stefansson brought along a professional photographer. Thanks for doing that. We have images to prove this happened. And a cameraman, that man's name was George Wilkins, who ended up going on to have an illustrious photographic career and a pretty amazing person. But at the heart, this story is about two men. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, he was an Icelandic, American, Canadian-born explorer and ethnologist. This is the part I like. He was born William and nicknamed Willie by his family. He illegally changed his name later to Vilhjalmur as a nod to his Icelandic tradition, but his friends called him Steph. And I have to say that writing Vilhjalmur about 372 times during this book, I still don't know how to spell it without looking. He had just returned at the beginning where we meet him from 4 years in the Arctic with stories of the so-called blonde Eskimos, light-skinned, blue-eyed peoples that might be descendants of Leif Erikson, who we meet on the drive-in, which I like. At 33 years old, he didn't really possess the sort of stunning Nordic handsomeness of Nansen, the Norwegian, or the craggy, leather-skinned appearance of our man Robert Peary over there. But he had this fiery attitude, and he was sort of this knot of sinew and dreams and bravado. He's famous for saying, "An adventure is a sign of incompetence." And I use that rather ironically as an epigraph to this book, because it's quite an adventure. He did know how to raise money very well and convince backers such as the American Museum of Natural History and the Canadian government to back his ventures. And you know, they were really expensive, and at the time, the mortality of most Arctic adventure was about 50%. And so it became harder and harder to convince patrons and backers to support these endeavors where, you know, half the people are going to die and you're going to lose your ships. He ended up being pretty good at it. And he convinced that the Canadian government, including the Prime Minister, that his ideas were sound and that it was going to be worthwhile to do this. On the flip side of this coin, the Newfoundlander Bob Bartlett was a member of this really famous family from Brigus, Newfoundland, who had skippered ships in the whaling and seal and cod fisheries for generations. He had also recently captained the iron-hulled Roosevelt, which an amazing ship that Peary had made for his North Pole attempts. And Peary recommended Bartlett to Stefansson as the world's greatest living ice navigator. A little sidebar: Bartlett had been he made it to within 150 miles of the North Pole on one of Peary's final trip in which he claimed the North Pole, and then Bartlett was asked to turn back and go back to the Roosevelt, and he took Matthew Henson instead. It ended up being a very controversial move because, as some of you may know, Peary's claim of the North Pole has been contested. And had he brought Bob Bartlett along, who was a master with sextant and at knowing where they were, it's very likely that we would know for certain whether Peary made it to the North Pole or not. But for reasons I won't get into, he ended up sending Bartlett back, to which Bartlett actually says in the book, I have to admit I cried a little because he was so close to polar immortality. So in 1913, when this trip is being organized, Stefansson was really hurried and disorganized in putting this thing together. He didn't have a lot of time. His plan was to rendezvous these three ships, the Karluk, the Alaska, and the Mary Sachs, and to convene at a place called Herschel Island, which is way to the east above northern Canada. In their hurry to get there, Stefansson actually had some of the wrong members on the wrong ships, the wrong equipment on the wrong ships, and he did one thing that was brilliant, which was to hire not only this family, it's Karluk, the husband, and then Auntie Karluk, the daughter Helen, who was 11, and the little girl Mugpi, who's 3. He hired them to do all sorts of really important Arctic work, including driving the dog teams, sewing Arctic clothing, ice navigating, and also he hired a couple hunters, not pictured as this guy Kadektovic, who figures very prominently in the story, who was a superior hunter and dog sled driver. And I make the case with great confidence that had he not hired this family, everyone would have died. It's pretty clear to me. So good on you, Stefansson, for doing that. But he was a little slipshod in some of his organizational skills. And so he ended up purchasing for the expedition the ship, the Karluk, which is the Aleut word for fish. It was a 129-foot, 247-ton American-built steam brigantine that had served for three decades in the salmon fishing industry. It had a 150 horsepower steam engine, but was not really suited or sheathed for sea ice. And the chief engineer, John Monroe, actually joked when he saw the ship that it had, its engine had about as much power as an old coffee pot, which is not what you want when you're bucking sea ice, weighing hundreds of thousands of tons. So just 6 weeks after they sailed from Esquimalt, British Columbia, the Karluk encountered heavy fog, sleet, snow, and this is in August of 1913. They all take off, and then they just hit by a pretty big storm. And very early on, they become beset or nipped in the ice in a square mile of ice about above Prudhoe Bay. And of course, they claim it was the worst storm on record, but the more I read Arctic literature, it's always the worst storm on record. And you're like, is it ever not horrific up there? So they get locked in ice and they begin drifting toward the northwest and away from shore. And this is before they've ever reconvened and made it to Herschel Island to sort of reorganize all their gear. And meanwhile, Auntie and the girls and everyone is like sewing Arctic clothing and trying to get as prepared as possible. They've purchased a bunch in Barrow, Alaska. So as they drifted, they attempted to use these umiaks, which I had the great pleasure of seeing in the small craft exhibit today, an umiak. And when you see them in real life, it's kind of amazing. They look like wood because of the color of the skins, but they're ugruk, bearded seal skin, or sometimes walrus skin. And so the plan was, if we get stuck, we can maybe find open leads in the water and paddle our way back to shore. But as you can see, the condition of the ice proved way too difficult. The ice isn't flat, it's buckled and crenellated and hummocked and sharp. And so it's jagged with these giant open leads of water everywhere. And so if you fall in, you might very well drown or freeze to death from hypothermia. And I will say that the polar ice is, I'll call it awesome and beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. And I have a little excerpt from the book describing the polar ice by the Scottish schoolmaster, William McKinley, who came along as the meteorologist. And for a time, they sat motionless in a shallow slick of still water between leads. But then, imperceptibly at first, they started to drift. From the deck, McKinley was filled with a sense of awe and wonder at all his new experiences, at everything he was witnessing. He'd seen his first polar bear and walrus, his first ice blink. He'd climbed the rigging to the top of the mainmast and seen a spectacular mirage, the appearance of land towering hundreds of feet in the distance, but learned that it was an optical illusion, the result of temperature inversion and the bending of light. Now, McKinley stood and watched the skies and surveyed the ice, mesmerized by its character, its power, its spectacular, unsettling sounds, sometimes crackling like gunfire, sometimes shrieking as it split and cleaved. Sometimes it seemed almost to have the throaty, guttural sound of an animal roaring as it came together or parted. As he watched and felt wind stirring, he sensed the ship begin drifting fast toward the northwest, once again away from their destination. Once, he believed he could see open water to the east and thought that if they could somehow reach it, they might just get clear. But not yet, not tonight. What he thought was open water was just another mirage. That evening, he felt minuscule and vulnerable, writing in his journal, "The ice tonight was being crushed everywhere badly, being reduced in most places to a powder. It is a fascinating sight to watch the square miles of ice slowly moving together, while the noise of the breaking and raftering, almost terrifying one with the roar." So there were a couple of the men, oceanographer James Murray and Alistair Forbes Mackay, who had been with Shackleton on his 1909 Nimrod expedition. This is an expedition before the Endurance. And they began plotting to leave the Karluk and strike out on their own. And there were all these murmurings around the ship. And one member wrote in his diary, and a lot of this book is based on members' diaries, he wrote in his diary that there are secret conclaves going on is certain. So you get this foreboding sense that as they're drifting out into the Arctic, that people start to want off the ship. And you can see that the decks that are overloaded with bags of coal, there's Peterborough canoes, which were meant for the southern party to use on the Mackenzie River, and now they're nowhere near the Mackenzie River. And during the initial drift, Stefansson also wanted off the ship for reasons that I won't quite divulge now. So he organized this caribou hunt, claiming that that they needed fresh meat. But they had a lot of seal anyway, so I don't really buy this, his rationale. And so on September 20th, 1913, Stefansson departed with 3 of the scientists, a photographer, 2 of the best hunters, and a dozen of the best sled dogs. And he left instructions for Captain Bartlett saying he'd be gone for 10 days to 2 weeks, quote, in his letter, "if no accident happens." Well, in the Arctic, accidents always happen. So I don't know if he really figured he was ever coming back or not. Stefansson's departure from this ship would end up being the most controversial decision that he ever made in his life. So this big storm blows in the day after Stefansson leaves, and the Karluk, encased in this floe, begins careening out into the Arctic Ocean sometimes at 60 miles a day. And Bartlett and the rest of the remaining crew and scientists are drifting along on a square mile of ice for 5 months, moving west about 500 miles into the Chukchi Sea to some 100 miles north of Wrangel Island, which is off the northern coast of northeastern Siberia. While drifting, they did have time to do things like ski. This one Norwegian brought a bunch of skis and taught a number of the members how to ski. They had chess tournaments. They celebrated Christmas and New Year's and did sports competitions. So, you know, they're trying to make the best of it. But the problem is they begin reading the journals from Captain DeLong's book about the fate of the Jeanette, 1879, which, I know, did Hampton Sides come here and talked about in the Kingdom of Ice? So that doesn't go so well either. And when you're drifting on ice on the exact trajectory and drift pattern that Fridtjof Nansen has been in the Fram, and also Captain DeLong in the Jeanette, it's a little unnerving knowing that you're heading toward this icy, watery, probable grave. So they begin offloading some of this stuff on the ship and banking it up, as you can see here, with ice blocks, because it's starting, the other ice that's encroaching on their flow is beginning to imperil the hull. And they bank it up with these blocks, but the massive fangs of ice eventually begin to pierce the hulls. And there's a quote from Bartlett that I really like. He says, the poor old Karluk creaked and groaned, and once or twice actually sobbed as the water oozed through her seams. There is nothing more human than a ship in ice pressure. And she ends up succumbing to the ice pressure and sinking in 37 fathoms of water. And I wanted to read you this, one of my favorite passages. This is the spoiler problem, but whatever. There it is. Let me just quickly check something. So this is January 10th, 1914. By 11 p.m., the engine room was submerged in 11 feet of water. The Karluk remained afloat only because it was being pressured on both sides, held there by giant jaws of ice. Nearly everyone had been working through the night, taking breaks only to warm themselves with hot coffee in the galley. Now all that remained was to gather the last of their personal belongings and leave the ship for the box house and igloo where sleeping assignments had been made. Captain Bartlett congratulated everyone on their efforts, and at midnight had the Canadian blue ensign hoisted for the last time to the main topmast. At 2 in the morning, he ordered all to turn into their respective dwellings on the ice to try to get some sleep, or at least some rest. Bartlett stayed aboard the ship. He'd packed his personal effects, log books and journals, and now he went to his cabin. He went from his cabin to the galley where he stoked a huge fire. Men periodically came to visit him during the night. McKinley had been too wet and cold to sleep, so he went aboard and found Bartlett there in the galley with Hadley, the gramophone blaring as loud as it could go. Bartlett had all 150 records stacked in a pile, and he'd put on a record, play it through, then lift it and toss it into the galley fire and put on another. He did this over and over, one record after the next. After every dozen records or so, the captain walked to the starboard deck and checked the ship's position. He eyed the surroundings, scouting a safe and speedy exit route. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the water in the engine room had crested the gratings and was just 5 feet below the main deck. When he returned to the galley, he found Hadley searching frantically for the little searching frantically for the little ship's cat, Nijirarok. It was a little black kitten. Hadley had successfully moved his dog, Molly, and her newborn puppies to the ice shelters, but no one had seen the kitten and all the commotion during the night. At last, they heard her mewing from a hiding place aft, and Hadley managed to catch her and take her out to the box house, placing her in a basket lined with furs and skins. Throughout the day, Bartlett remained on the Karluk playing records. Over in the ice houses, everyone was trying to stay warm, dry out clothes, and eat as much as they could get their hands on. They were having something of a feast. Quote, rummaging among the boxes, wrote McKinley, we broke out a tin of ox tongue, tins of roast beef and mutton, several tins of salmon, salt pork, cheese, and about half a dozen old loaves. They stuffed themselves until they could eat no more, then lay back on their sleeping bags, smoking cigars. In the afternoon, they took a sounding and found the bottom at 38 fathoms. At 3:15, Bartlett felt a lurch beneath his feet and a shudder as the ship settled with a groan. Water cascaded over the decks and ran down the hatches, and Bartlett knew it was finally time. He reached for a record, Chopin's Funeral March, placed it on the Victrola, and wound it full, closing his eyes as the first notes rose above the surge of rushing water. Then he left the galley and went to the railing, holding on tight as the ship was sinking. "She's going," he yelled out, and one by one, seamen and crewmen and scientists came from the igloo and snow house and stood on the ice. They came as close as they could, watching Bartlett standing there alone. Then, with the notes of Funeral March lofting into the breeze, accompanied by the percussive sounds of ship timbers buckling and snapping, Bartlett waited until the rail was just even with the ice, and he stepped off his ship. Everyone was speechless. They watched as the ship lowered slowly on an even keel. A puff of steam burst upward as water poured in and doused the galley fire. With grace and dignity, the Karluk continued downward until only the crow's nest was visible above the water, and at last, the Canadian blue ensign, flapping in the Arctic wind, submerged into the water and was gone. He had a flair for the dramatic, didn't he? He had also planned very well. So they named this place Shipwreck Camp, and they had offloaded thousands of pounds of food, coal, provisions for months of living on the floe, and they would need them. You can see the stovepipes, a couple of stovepipes, and then some of Bjarne Mommen's skis. But they had 22 men, 1 woman, 2 children, 24 dogs, 6 puppies, and the ship's cat now stranded on a floe. And Bartlett felt responsible for all of their lives. They spent 2 months on this floe during the long night of Arctic winter, and Bartlett had spotted, prior to the Karluk sinking, this landmass, which he believed was Wrangel Island in the distance. And so he began to set up a series of relays, sending dogs and sleds, double hauling, and building igloos and cache depots along the way, also encountering giant pressure ridges of over 100 feet high, which some of these extended maybe 2-3 miles. And so it wasn't exactly smooth going. And so they built this series of igloos from Shipwreck Camp to Wrangel Island, using these to rest, sleep, and cache food and gear. They reached at a certain point this massive pressure ridge, which they called a mountain range of ice, and they had to cut their way through it. And many times the sea ice on their way also opened up underneath their igloos, threatening to engulf them and swallow them. And Bartlett said this was the toughest job he ever tackled, even though he almost made it to the North Pole. Amazingly, his ordeal was just beginning, as it turned out. So the place they'd seen, Wrangel Island, is about 100 miles above northern Siberia, and this is Bjarne Mommen's depiction of it. It's pretty accurate, actually. They were close. He called Berry Peak at I think 3,500 feet, and it was that was pretty close. Wrangel Island's interesting. It's believed to be the last place on Earth to have supported populations of woolly mammoths. But they landed over here at this place called Icy Spit. Icy Spit right there. And John Muir, the naturalist, had been there on the Corwin, actually, which appears in this book, looking for the fate of Captain DeLong. And he described this place as severely isolated land in the topmost frost-killed end of creation. Who wants to vacation there? And it was here that the survivors were going to have to make their stand. Yeah. Oh, this is Mom, this is actually Mommen's sketch. So he missed it by 1,000 feet, but not bad. And it's quite accurate. So within a few days of landing, Bartlett knew what he had to do because many of the members were hypothermic, frostbitten, and in poor shape. It had taken them 3 weeks to get here from floating shipwreck camp. And no one else in the world knows where they are. And so Bartlett decides that he's going to take Kadektovik, a 19-year-old Inuit hunter, across the long strait from the southern point of this island and cross to Siberia, where if he can then find people to help him travel over 700 miles to the end of eastern Siberia, get a ship over to Alaska and send word to the world that there are marooned members surviving on Wrangel Island. Otherwise, he believed that all of them would die. So he only stayed on Wrangel Island for a few days. And then he instructed them to make camps at a couple of points on Icy Spit, Cape Waring, at 3 different points along the eastern shoreline, and sort of try to subsist by hunting and gathering. There was driftwood, mercifully for them, but he said he was going to, if he could make it across, he would come in late July to Rogers Harbor at the very southern point of the island, and that's where they should be. And if he got through, he was going to send help. And he knew from some logbooks that he had read that it was about a 700-mile journey. And much of their time on Wrangel Island, so now you've got these people marooned here. It's sort of like Lord of the Flies on ice or something, on ice and stone. It was, and some of them were very isolated. 2 members, sometimes 2 to 3 members, were alone at the very bottom and trying to subsist. There was some food. It was scarce, but they were able to find seals, Arctic foxes, the common mure or auk, which I'll talk about in a second, and because they discovered that there were a lot of birds on these cliffs, and they were kind of reduced after a while to eating rancid seal blubber and even tails and flippers that had sat outside in the storage tin so long that they were mealy and rotten. But you could see the cliffs beyond the tent at Cape Waring had thousands and thousands of these shorebirds. Now, they had made a mistake when they left the Karluk, and they brought mostly rifles and pistols, and they didn't have shotguns, which would have been very useful as fowling pieces. But they contrived some pretty interesting techniques for getting these mures, including building ladders out of driftwood and also some line and rope from the Karluk. And McKinley describes the terrifying, I mean, they're also beginning to be famished and in starvation mode. So they're trying to scale these cliffs and steal the eggs or shoot numbers of the birds to survive. And it was extremely dangerous in their weakened conditions. The seals were really difficult to procure. Karluk was the best at it. This guy, John Hadley, who Stefansson had hired at Point Barrow, was 59 at the time, and it was actually one of the better seal hunters. But it would take half a day of sitting silently on the ice, waiting for them to come up to breathe. And the Inuit were by far the most effective at this, but there just weren't enough seals to sustain them. And I forgot to mention that when they left shipwreck camp, they had thousands and thousands of pounds of food, but it proved too difficult for them to move all that food in these relays that they had to do on sledges with dogs in their condition. So they arrived at Wrangel Island with not enough to survive the entire, for an extended period of time, or certainly not for another winter. Yeah, Auntie was very industrious, and she used every part of the seal, even blubber, to make what McKinley called tongue-in-cheek salad oil, and he describes it thusly. The oil is made by cutting blubber into small pieces and putting it in a little poke, which is a seal skin cut in a way that the skin is complete except for a hole at the top, at the neck, and at the bottom of the tail of this little poke. And the blubber-filled poke was then left outside until the blubber fermented into a sour-tasting oil. Into this oil, they dipped chunks of blubber, making it slightly more palatable than straight blubber. Have you all finished eating? Okay. I forgot about that part. Anyway, so there again, you can see the cliffs off of Waring Point. They're pretty dramatic, and they would try to approach them from the top, or yeah, it was too dangerous from the ice. But Auntie also began jigging for Arctic tomcod in these tidal cracks, and she used a bent sewing pin as a hook and sinew for a line, and she would just dangle it down there and sort of snag them and pull them up on shore, and was doing okay with that. And little Helen, the 11-year-old, devised a method to snare seagulls using seal blubber as skewered on a feather quill and attached to a sinew or line, and the gull would eat the blubber, and then she would yank this gull over to her and wring its neck, and she was pretty successful at that. And then Karluk and McKinley, Auntie's husband Karluk and McKinley, built a kayak with a hatchet and adze and seal skins, and Auntie stretched these around the kayak, and I saw a really impressive tandem skin kayak in the small craft room today. And I wanted to just read another part about this walrus attempt to hunt walrus. When it became clear that the group of a dozen members would not survive another winter on tomcod and seagulls, Karluk agreed to build a kayak to hunt the icy waters offshore for seals and maybe walruses. Karluk was at first reluctant, and his reservations were reasonable. It was dangerous hunting seals or walruses in a small one-person kayak. Capsizing in that icy water meant certain death. Enormous walruses weighing up to 3,000 pounds were terrifying. Their huge white ivory tusks, protruding 2 feet long straight out of their mouths like spears, could pierce his skin kayak and sink him in an instant. Karluk knew that he was the only one among them who was experienced using a kayak, so it was his life that would be at risk. But since he alone possessed the skill, he agreed to build one. He found a couple of logs long enough to cut lengths for the frame and dragged these near the tents where he could sit on a stump and work, and McKinley helped him. For tools, he used a skinning knife, a snow knife, an axe, and a hatchet. Karluk used the hatchet blade as an adze to rough out the side rails and rib frames from logs. The construction was slow, painstaking, and he lashed the separate pieces of the framework together with sealskin's thongs. He carved and whittled a double-bladed paddle out of a washed-up plank of lumber, and after 2 weeks, he brought the frame inside his family's tent to dry. Auntie took measurements and cut lengths and sewed these together tight around the frame, and the kayak was complete. Everyone was really impressed, and one of the members wrote in their journal, when finished, one member's diary reported, it looked as if it had been made by some expert boat builder with modern tools and convenience instead of only with a hatchet and a knife. And then, almost as if on cue, the shipwreck survivors could hear a distinct barking and bellowing, the lion-like roars of walruses in the bay. Karluk crept down to the water and eased the boat into a small open lead, his eyes always on the massive brown creatures lazing on the ice floe a few hundred yards offshore. His heart pounded and his hands were clammy inside his mittens, but he grabbed the two-bladed paddle in one hand, his rifle in the other, and slid into the boat. Winds were light and favorable, and he could see an open lane skirting around the floe on which a pod of 5 enormous animals was sunning. If he took his time and didn't spook them, he might be able to paddle into position for a shot. Now, everyone's hopes for survival depended on his courage and skill. as the food was diminishing and the thought of wintering on Wrangel Island weighed on everyone, they planned on building a cabin inland, anticipating what are as low as minus 70 degree Fahrenheit temperatures for the coming winter. While all this is happening, I cut back and forth between what's happening on Wrangel Island and what's happening with Bartlett and Karluk on their Odyssey ordeal. And while Bartlett and Karluk are crossing the dangerous long strait, the survivors are barely hanging on Wrangel Island, praying for rescue and planning for the worst. Many of the members were afflicted with this mysterious illness, a kind of mystery malady that we learn a little bit about later at the end of what it might have been, but no one could explain it. They're really getting swollen, and they're basically invalids. They build an igloo called hospital igloo, and the Mammen, the Norwegian, writes in his journal, "All my limbs are about twice as thick as ordinary. I can hardly walk, and I move like an old man. I don't know how this will end. The prospects are not bright." And now it's a race against time. Will Bartlett and Karluk make it through to organize a rescue mission, or will they all perish on the barren shores of Wrangel Island? And you're going to have to read the book to find out. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And questions. Oh, I'm just checking my time. Not that bad.
No, you did great, buddy. And you do need to read the book because you will freeze to death. It is an unbelievable book, and you feel like you know every one of those characters that he writes about, so it's fascinating. Question from the room? Yes, sir. And oh, I'm sorry. Hey.
They were first.
And then we'll go to an online question.
I have two questions. One, why did they choose to go there in the winter? Why didn't they go in July?
Well, so they left in June, and
Okay,
they end up, the problem with that part of the world is that it's usually winter. There's about 2 months of, now, of course, there's more open water around Wrangel Island and some of these places.
Yeah, that was my second question. Yeah. What's it like now, over 100 years later?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are finding, and this was in the previous book that I wrote, Labyrinth of Ice, about the Greely expedition to Greenland. It was a scientific expedition also, and they were taking sometimes up to 500 to 1,000 separate readings a day, and they managed to get all of this information back in 1884. And what actually Noah used some of this information because he got this baseline data from 1884 of this was ice depth. Drifting of sea ice, temperatures of it, and so we're seeing significant, of course, diminishment of the Greenlandic ice cap and all of the glaciers. But even now, like around, it's a little easier to get to Wrangel Island. I have to say that one of my great, I try to go to every place that I write about, and I had 2 separate trips organized for me to go and spend camp for a week on Wrangel Island. It's Russian territory. So the first summer I was going to go while I was researching the book, COVID happened, and then we weren't allowed to travel there. And the second time I was going to go, Russia invaded Ukraine, and so we weren't allowed to go there. So it's a big, I'm going to go there eventually because I really, really want to see this place. I'm going to have to, I guess, settle for Svalbard, Norway in about a month. But, okay.
An online question?
Oh, who's the online guru?
I took Jenna's microphone. So we have someone online asking if you can show the journey slide again.
Oh, hold on, I forgot to go to that one's gone. Oh, I broke it. Tim? I don't know what I did.
You just ended the slideshow, so it's
Oh. Yeah, I was wondering, okay, yeah, that used to be the last slide. Which slide?
The journey slide.
Ah, the journey.
Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna make it. Okay. Sure. Is that all they want, or is there a question?
Yeah.
It's a great slide. I will hand you that. One of my favorites. Oh, they just want to see where they were. Yeah. So the drift, yeah, I mean, you can see that Wrangel Island's there, and, you know, they started, another thing I forgot to mention, which is really interesting, and it has to do with Stefansson's character. So while he had just come back from 4 years in the Arctic, and he was writing a book that he felt very strongly would be a bestseller about that ended up being called My Life with the Eskimo, and it was a bestseller. And while everyone was going up to convene at Nome and Point Barrow, Stefansson took like a luxury liner, and he had an editor from the Museum of Natural History and a personal assistant, and he was drafting a book about a previous expedition instead of planning this one. And so he arrives, and everyone's a little miffed, like, where have you been? And then, you know, he ultimately abandons his flagship to go caribou hunting. So I'm not that kind to Stefansson in the book, just because you've kind of got these two characters who are very clearly, one risks his life to go save everyone, and the other, I won't say everything. We do run into Stefansson again. So I cut back and forth a number of times between what he's doing or not doing, and what's happening to these guys. Other questions?
Another question from the room?
Julie, right here.
Where are you? Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yes, was Bartlett also the captain of the support ship for Perry?
The support ship, I'm not sure if he was on, because he went on 3 separate expeditions with Perry, and in one of them, Bartlett's uncle was the captain, and Perry, Robert Perry was, he was a hand, or he wasn't the captain yet. Bartlett was he had his, I mean, he might have still been working on his Master Mariner licensing. Did you run into a story in which you remember that?
Well, it was just about Perry's claim to the pole and the support group.
Oh yeah,
he had sent back to the ship, and it was just him, his
Henson, and then 4 Greenlanders.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Bartlett was part of what was called the Advanced Pioneer Team. So as they were moving north, he was breaking trail and setting up igloos to pave the trail, essentially, all the way up to within 150 miles. And then that's why it was so crushing when he was asked to return, because he would have made it. I'm certain of it.
Definitely, and Perry almost caught up with him and claimed that he found a lead frozen over, so it was like skating back.
Yeah, and
So-
there's some.
It's very questionable.
Yeah, I'm going to be bringing that up in my next book. That's actually true.
I'm just curious, you said there were scientists aboard, and you mentioned a meteorologist. What other kinds of science was
So
happening
geographers, geographers, archaeologists, marine biologists, and you know, this is the big tragedy for me of this book, because not of this book, but of the story, is because they never, at least insofar as Karluk, the Karluk is the members there, they didn't get to do what they were trying to do. Now, Stefansson, this is spoiler, but Stefansson regroups and retools a Southern party and ends up staying in the Arctic for 4 more years. And there's an entire book written about what they discovered, including some new islands that had previously not been seen before. But then also ethnological study, living with the native peoples and learning language. So it was very ambitious. The problem is, so to me, I mean, it's a great scientific endeavor, some of which we have the record of and we learned a lot of from. But, you know, I'm about the adventure narrative. So like that was less interesting to me than this survival story on frozen polar seas. But yeah, there's, if you want, I can direct you to the 700-page tome that Stefansson wrote after the fact, if you want. It's called, by the way, The Friendly Arctic, which is pretty ironic too, because most people who went there died, you know. So how friendly was it really?
We have two more questions online, Buddy. The first is, do they still hunt seal and walrus up there? And did you get to try it?
Oh, well, so in 2003, when I was in Greenland, they very much were hunting seal and walrus. And I did get to try, well, I tried whale and seal. And certainly, I mean, it's seal, yes. Walrus, and by the way, Wrangel Island too is one of the, well, Wrangel Island is a major polar bear denning island, one of the largest in the world, and the Pacific walrus, some of the largest numbers of Pacific walrus. I'm not sure what the status is on hunting them today, and I hope that there are pretty serious restrictions on it. But that's, you know, that's just me personally. Good question, though. I'll be.
We've got one more question in the room, and then we'll hop back over to Jenna.
Just wanted to know, where was the car?
I'm trying to figure out. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Here I am. Where was the boat when Stefansson got off of it on that?
So
where was he?
Yeah, so it was only about, that's the thing, he kind of knew, he knew what was happening. So he was above, this isn't a great map, but he was above this place called Collinson Point. It's right about here. It's like 10 miles offshore.
Huh.
And, you know, one of the things that Stefansson said afterwards that made everyone really, it made the people, I mean, there are obviously some survivors or we wouldn't have the record, all of these journals that I used. But one of the things that irked members, including Bartlett, was that Stefansson said, I don't really understand what was so hard about moving across the ice. I mean, I did it, but he did it with, you know, a very small team. And what Stefansson was good at was moving in the Inuit style with a very small team, dog sled, and not with a whole bunch of people, many of whom had never traveled on Arctic ice. And so he was criticized for being nonchalant about saying, like, Bartlett should have taken them all across the Long Strait. Well, when you read about that, his ordeal going across the Long Strait, you realize that never would have worked. They didn't have the strength, and also it was really difficult to make it across. And so, yeah, Stefansson just bolted about 10 miles.
And he went to Alaska?
Yeah, well, he went to Alaska and Canada, and then he wrote some very cleverly penned letters to the Canadian government explaining where his missing flagship might be.
but didn't send anybody out to look for him or anything.
Well,
like
so he also, yeah, you're getting into some of the really meaty stuff that ends up happening but it's great because what Stefansson, I mean, part of it is he does understand, like by the time he ends up back on land and there's anything that he could do about it, he understands that the window of rescue is probably a month to 6 weeks long, and it's going to be next year. So he can't really do much about it at the time, except maybe begin organizing the people and the resources and the ships to be ready when the breakup occurs, and he can then send these ships there. But he doesn't do that because he's a bad man. I'm sorry. I'm always thinking I'm going to get contacted by, you know, one of Stefansson's relatives going, wait a minute.
That's funny. So the last
My
question.
great-grandfather.
The last question online is actually, did Stefansson's reputation survive after this expedition, after he left?
That's a very good question. Yes, in fact, yes. He's a noted polar dignitary. He wrote much about it. He wrote thousands of pages about his experiences. There are museum holdings at Dartmouth, and he lectured for many, many years. But this is kind of a dark spot on his reputation. And so I think it depends on if you're able to sort of get past what he did in abandoning his own ship. That's not, you're mariners, right? You don't abandon your ship, do you? So.
One more question for the room here.
So at that point, did he know that the expedition was doomed and then went hunting? And if he did know, why did he not take everybody with him?
That's a really great question. So there's this other element of intrigue that I discovered when I was researching the book, which I believe is partly what drove him to leave the ship. Because the caribou hunting story doesn't really hold up in that he also knew that the caribou population at the place where he disembarked and was going to land was very, not extinct, but really diminished at that time. And so nobody really bought that, but there's a little nugget that I don't want to say that might have been why he left. And it's quite intriguing. The fact that he kept it a secret, I'll put it this way, he kept the reason a secret, but Robert Peary did not keep this a secret in his own life. And so, yeah, he just, it's somewhat inexplicable. He if you read what Stefansson says about it, he makes a pretty good case. It's that he, they needed meat, and he didn't expect to be gone long. And in fact, accidents happen in the Arctic, and who can predict a big storm? But there's an incredible scene in which Stefansson leaves with this team, and they get stranded on this little island called Jones Island, and the ice has it hasn't frozen around it, and so he can't cross the water. And this big storm comes in, and then they build this observation tower out of driftwood, and there's actually an image that guy Wilkins took of Stefansson up there, like looking, kind of like, dude, where's my ship? And then the next morning, the clouds lift, the fog dissipates, and the Karluk's gone. And he's just, he has to explain to the Canadian government, I lost my ship. I don't know what to tell you. It's kind of embarrassing, actually.
This will be our last in-room question, because I get to.
Oh, then you're going to get me with the stumper.
So in leadership, there's a concept of first followers. You surround yourself with people that basically extend your leadership. It's what gets people off the bench to follow you. Did you learn, or in researching this, did you learn things about leadership you hadn't thought about before, or what really was salient? And leadership is at all levels. That's just the obvious two leaders.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually talked a little bit about this in this podcast that I got invited to be on called The Art of Manliness. Have you ever heard it? I think certainly this book is a really great sort of test ground for the do's and don'ts of leadership, because Bartlett leads by example. He understands when to ask a lot of the people he is in charge of, but he's not afraid to get dirty himself, to shovel coal, to be the one breaking the trail. And Stefansson was more, because I think he came from more of an academic background in part, and because he was thinking of himself as a scientist, that he thought of some of this. He was certainly willing to rough it. He lived out on the ice, but I think one of the things about leadership that you're talking about is also the delegation of authority, and also organizational and management skills. And Stefansson was not able to manage large groups of people, in part because he was self-serving, I believe, and there was a lot of ego involved there. Whereas Bartlett, I mean, the guy received the Hubbard Medal. He received two of the highest honors that you can receive in Arctic exploration, and yet, you know, he would be right out there sowing mucklucks, you know. And whereas, so yeah, I mean, the epilogue of the book talks a little bit about my take on those two men and their approach to leading others, and I clearly fall on the side of, you know, of leading by example, and by also trusting that people can do more than they think they're able to do, and giving them the opportunity, because he broke up teams when they were moving from shipwreck camp to Wrangel Island. You know, he selected very carefully who would lead the individual smaller groups, understanding their skills and weaknesses, and also their abilities to. He had observed them on the ship for a really long time, and he knew how they interacted with each other. So he was very, yeah. I learned a lot about leadership. Thank you.
And my question, you've got to tell us what you're working on next.
Oh, right. So thank you, Julie. I'm writing a book called Realm of Ice and Sky. I'm all about the ice for this is the last one, I promise. Realm of Ice and Sky, and it is about the first humans to attempt to fly to the North Pole in semi-rigid dirigibles or airships. And they started trying to do this in 1905. An American journalist named Walter Wellman was the first to attempt it. And this Swede named Solomon Andre had tried to do it in a balloon in 1897. But this amazing journalist, I did not even know about him until, has anyone here heard of Walter Wellman? So he tried to fly to the North Pole in a dirigible airship, and then he also tried to fly across the Atlantic in a dirigible. And this is it's a really cool period because we've got the Wright brothers. They're vying for air supremacy between the airplane and the airship. And the airship, there were a lot of practical reasons why it might have been. If had things gone a little differently, we would be flying around in blimps. I mean, it would help if they didn't blow up as often as they do. The Hindenburg put the hit on blimp travel. But I will tell you that one of the things I've learned in my research is that the airship is back in a big way, and I call it Airship 2.0. And in fact, there's a company called Ocean Sky Cruises. This is going to be in the epilogue of my new book about how you're going to be able to purchase a ticket to fly to the North Pole in an airship in about a year or two for about $200,000. But they're going to be also used for humanitarian aid. These things are amazing. One of the groups is being built by, or one of the airship companies is Lighter Than Air Research, created by Sergey Brin of Google. They're building them in Ohio, California, and they're building them in the East, in Europe. And they're all, they've got these great ideas. I mean, some of them, they're as long as from here to the front doors, that can hover over, places that have had disasters happen to them and drop down food and shelter and water and serve as a mobile hovering cell tower. And so that's going to be in the end. But the book concerns these earliest attempts to fly to the North Pole in blimps and this spectacular crash by an Italian named Umberto Nobile in 1928. And Amundsen, the great Norwegian explorer who actually was the first to make it to the South Pole. I argue that he was the first to make it to the North Pole, but albeit in 1926, he was on a airship expedition, and they crossed over the North Pole from Svalbard in north of northern Norway, and then flew all the way to Teller, Alaska, across the polar seas. And then Amundsen, it's an amazing story because after the Nobile's airship, the Italia, crashes, there's the largest international search polar search in history, I mean, you could argue that the search for Franklin is, but that took decades. This one takes weeks and months. And then Amundsen ends up coming out of retirement to try to fly and go be the guy who saves Umberto Nobile on the ice and leaves Tromsø, Norway, and flies off into the mist, never to be seen again. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. You guys are great.
Thank you, Buddy.